Are there any parents of daughters here? And if one day your daughter found herself trapped in a violent marriage, what would you do? Would you wait for her to come to you for help, or would you be the one to step through that door, breaking every barrier to protect her? Today, Snail's story will share with you the story of Walter, a former police chief, and Clara's father. When Clara was stuck in a life filled with fear alongside an abusive husband, Walter did not turn his back. But what's even more surprising is that Sophie, a 10-year-old girl, was the one who held the crucial piece that helped both mother and Q. IQ's only ruby kiss has the luxurious texture that glides. Its scariest mix Quaid and Missy's. Lee was Alext. While life's quipped home was Missy-esting, with Corey-essing, Milise, with C's. It's seemalized Beways Bewai Pace with Cziad, Quiz. We see CC with Cziad C. We see Luz by We Are. Icaris it's on Beclod, Prit, Kut, Moakai Liat it Ruia as it sepida seats of Siki Cas it's a lat sis, Ktai we to see it I gay it's a kill a police. Daughter escape. If you believe that true love never stands by in the face of pain, stay until the very end of this story. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Snail's Story, so that every week we can take another slow journey together, one that's heartfelt to the very last breath. Asterisk from the outside. The Harlow family's White 2 story. Home in the coastal town of Cedar Cove looked as though it had stepped right off the cover of an architecture magazine. The facade was clad in polished pine, with wide windows opening toward the sea and a second-floor balcony draped in bright red geraniums. On sunny days, the waves striking the rocky shore out front made a steady music, inviting passers-by to imagine a peaceful life inside. Clara Jennings once believed in that dream. She had met Richard Harlow at a community workshop when she was a newly minted teacher. He was tall, spoke with confidence, and had a smile that put people at ease. Richard was already the owner of a growing construction company, well-connected, and generous toward those he wanted to impress. To Clara, he was the sort of solid, dependable man she thought would always protect her. But the rosy picture lasted only through the first few years of marriage. When Clara became pregnant with Sophie, Richard began to change first with small suggestions. You should wear this color. It suits you better. Or why don't you stay home and rest? Let me handle the money. Then the suggestions became orders, then criticism, and eventually bursts of anger without reason. The Ocean View house their once shared dream slowly became a locked box. A place where Clara learned to walk softly, speak just enough, and avoid anything that might set Richard off. Because when his temper flared, no one in the house was truly safe. Sophie, only 8 at the time, had already begun to notice something was wrong. She was perceptive, catching every glance, every sigh from her mother. On some nights, when the waves still pounded steadily outside but a storm brewed inside, Sophie would hide in her room, clutching her brown teddy bear, listening to her father's footsteps pounding across the hardwood floor. Clara used to think her daughter didn't understand. But Sophie's eyes, whenever she saw her mother trying to hold back tears, told her otherwise. Clara never told her father. Walter Jennings. What was happening? Walter was the former police chief of Cedar Cove, a man who had spent over 30 years on the front line, everything from solving burglaries to confronting dangerous drug traffickers. He was known for being strict, fair, and for his particular hatred of domestic violence. Clara knew that if Walter found out, he would confront Richard immediately, and that might make things even worse for her and Sophie. So Clara stayed silent. She used the excuse of being busy with teaching to limit visits to her father's house, and each phone call ended with her assuring him everything was fine. Walter never pressed, but Clara knew he could feel the distance. One early autumn afternoon, with the salty ocean breeze drifting through the kitchen window, Clara was slicing carrots when she heard Richard's car pull into the driveway. Her heartbeat quickened a reflex she'd grown used to over the years. Sophie was at the dining table, bent over her math homework, but her small shoulders tensed. Neither of them spoke, but they both heard the car door slam and heavy footsteps. Approaching the front door, Richard walked in, shirt still crisp, tie slightly askew. His eyes swept the kitchen before he spoke without greeting his wife or daughter. "You still haven't cleaned that spot on the table? I told you this morning." Clara set down the knife and quickly grabbed a cloth to wipe the juice stain. "Left from lunch? I'm sorry, I forgot." "You always forget," Richard muttered, just loud enough for Sophie to hear. The girl looked up, meeting her mother's before flicking to her father. Clara forced a reassuring smile, though something pinched inside her. For years, she had tried to shield Sophie from these pointless flashes of temper. But there weren't many hiding places in the house. That evening, after dinner, Richard went upstairs to take a phone call while Clara washed the dishes. Sophie sat at the kitchen table again this time, not doing homework, but doodling in her notebook. After a while, she spoke quietly. "Mom, does Dad hurt you?" The question froze. Clara in place, a wet plate still in her hands. She turned, ready to brush it off with a laugh, but Sophie's serious gaze stopped her. "Why do you ask?" Just see you holding your arm, your shoulder. And once, I heard you crying in the bathroom." Sophie's voice was soft, as if afraid of her own words. Clara swallowed hard. She was used to hiding bruises under long sleeves, to explaining them away as trips and falls. But Sophie had seen more than she'd realized. "I'm fine," Clara said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups—" "I don't think so," Sophie interrupted, her voice unusually calm. "I think Dad makes you sad." Clara didn't answer. In her mind, she thought of Walter, her father, and the times he had spoken about breaking up domestic abuse cases, rescuing a wife from a violent husband. He had said once, "No one has the right to make someone else feel unsafe in their own home." If he knew about this, the sound of footsteps descending from upstairs cut her thoughts short. Richard entered the kitchen, a cold smile on his lips. "My parents are coming over tomorrow. Make sure dinner is perfect." "Yes," Clara murmured. When Richard left the room, Sophie tilted her head and whispered, "Mom, if something happens, Grandpa would protect us, right?" Clara looked at her daughter, her heart tightening. "Yes, but we don't need to worry him." Sophie said nothing more, bending over her sketchbook again. But Clara didn't know that, at that very moment, a plan was already forming in her daughter's mind, the plan that would one day change both their lives forever. 2 weeks after that evening, Cedar Cove slipped into the final days of October, when the sea wind turned sharp and the maple leaves burned crimson. In Sophie's classroom, Ms. Elaine assigned the children a month-long science project. Choose a phenomenon in daily life. Observe, take notes, and gather evidence to prove your conclusion. Sophie, already a science lover and an avid fan of investigative TV shows, was more excited than usual. But instead of choosing safe topics like bean seed germination or tidal water levels, she quietly wrote in her notebook, "My family." That night, Clara was working on her lesson plans at the dining table when Sophie brought her schoolwork over and sat across from her. She pretended to do her math homework, but kept glancing up at her mother. Finally, Sophie asked softly, "Mom, if you want to collect evidence, how do you do it without being noticed?" Clara looked up, a little surprised. "What are you planning to research?" "I'm not sure yet," Sophie answered, her voice light as the wind. "But Ms. Elaine said the evidence has to be objective, something that makes people believe it when they see it." Clara chuckled, assuming her daughter meant some harmless science experiment. "Well, you usually write down the process, take photos, or record videos. But remember, if you film people, you should ask permission first." Sophie nodded and said no more. That answer, unintended, had just opened a door for her. The next day, when Richard came home in a foul mood over a delayed construction project, Sophie was at the living room table, her tablet propped neatly in front of her. The screen faced the kitchen where Clara was tidying up and Richard had begun to complain. She pretended to work on homework, but her fingers brushed the record button. Richard's voice rang clearly in that first video. "What is this supposed to be? How many times have I told you?" Clara replied softly, trying to calm him, but Richard's tone grew sharper. Sophie kept her head down, heart pounding, and didn't stop recording until her father left the kitchen. The clip was under 2 minutes, but to Sophie, it was an important puzzle piece in the picture she was secretly assembling. That night, after Clara went to bed early with a headache, Sophie slipped into her room with the tablet, replayed the video, and listened to every word, every heavy sigh from her mother. In her notebook, she wrote, "November 5th, Dad yelled at Mom about dinner. Loud voice. Mom looked down. Over the following days, Sophie became more careful. She placed the tablet on the bookshelf in the living room among stacks of comic books, or leaned it against the flower vase on the dining table. When Richard came home and started to snap, the camera was already in place. One time, he shouted because Clara had forgotten to buy his favorite coffee. The sharp clink of a porcelain cup hitting the table echoed in the recording enough for anyone to feel the tension in that house. Sophie saved the file, naming it Coffee, November 8. At first, Sophie kept everything on the device, but then remembered her teacher's advice. Evidence should be protected so it can't be lost. She learned how to upload everything to a cloud storage account only she knew the password for. To be even safer, she created a backup account and sent all the files there as well. One evening, while Clara was folding laundry, Sophie came into her room with the tablet in hand. "Mom, if someone does something bad and you have proof, what should you do?" Clara froze for a moment, her eyes lingering on the tablet. What are you talking about?" "Just asking," Sophie said, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "If you have a video or a recording, who would you give it to so they could help you?" Clara's first instinct was to say, give it to a trusted adult. But the image of her father, Walter, rose in her mind, and it tightened her throat. "It depends on the situation, but just don't do anything dangerous, okay?" Sophie stayed silent, but determination flickered in her eyes. On November 12th, when Richard came home drunk, his breath heavy with alcohol and his words even harsher, Sophie recorded everything. In the video, Clara was washing dishes when Richard stepped close, pointing and spitting out cruel remarks. He never struck her, but the look in his eyes alone was enough to chill anyone watching. That night, Sophie didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, earbuds playing the recording again and again, mentally arranging the files in order, from mild to severe, from words to actions. She knew she needed a full chain of events to prove to an adult that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a repeated pattern. She also taught herself to adjust audio levels and trim out long silences to make the evidence clearer, all skills she learned from YouTube tutorials. Under the guise of editing videos for a science project, Clara began noticing her daughter carrying the tablet more often than usual. One day, she asked, "Why are you filming so much?" "I'm filming the ocean," Sophie replied with a smile, showing her a few prepared clips of waves and seagulls. Clara believed her instantly, never knowing that in the folder next to those images lay the stark truth. One Friday afternoon, while Richard was still at the office, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, opened her tablet, and for the first time created a folder labeled Safe. She uploaded all the videos, then sent the share link to her grandfather Walter's email. There was no long message, just for words. "Be ready, Grandpa." Somewhere across town, former police chief Walter Jennings opened his inbox and frowned at the subject line. He didn't yet know the full story, but the instinct that had saved him. In countless cases told him this was serious in the seaside house. Sophie closed her tablet and gazed out the window at the waves rolling steadily ashore, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew she was only just getting started. Mid-November in Cedar Cove carried its own shade of muted gray. The sky seemed wrapped in a thin veil of mist. The sea rippled gently, but held a chill that made people pull their coats tighter when stepping outside. Inside the seaside house, the air was just as heavy, only not because of the weather. Richard had started coming home later, in worse moods. Work calls ended with the snap of a phone slammed shut, his footsteps on the hardwood floor landing with a weight that signaled an oncoming storm. Clara had long recognized the signs, but Sophie hadn't, or rather, she had stopped choosing to avoid them. That afternoon, Richard came home earlier than usual, his face flushed with anger. He tossed his keys onto the table and thrust a folded newspaper at Clara. "Do you know the contract for the new housing project got delayed? People are saying you've been talking to the neighbors about me." Clara blinked in confusion. I didn't say anything." "Oh, don't play dumb." Richard stepped closer, his hand tightening into a fist. "If I find out you embarrassed me..." Sophie was at the living room table, her tablet tilted among a stack of books. The screen glowed, camera already rolling. She kept her head down as if she were writing, but her eyes followed every movement. Of her father, he didn't hit her mother, but his shouting filled the room, every word sharp enough for the microphone to catch. After unloading his accusations, he stormed upstairs, leaving Clara standing there with trembling shoulders. Sophie glanced at her, the question, "Are you okay?" in her eyes, but she said nothing. That evening, while Clara was preparing dinner, Richard started up again. He opened the fridge looking for his favorite beer, but it wasn't there. "What is this?" He held up a can with an unfamiliar label. "How many times have I told you which kind I drink?" "The store was out today, so I got this instead," Clara explained in an instant. The can was hurled to the floor, spraying foam and beer across the tiles. The metallic clang rang loud and sharp. Sophie flinched, but kept her hand steady. On the tablet, missing nothing. Clara bent to wipe the mess, keeping her voice calm. "I'm sorry. Next time. Richard cut her off with a cold laugh. "If there's a next time, I'll teach you a lesson." In her notebook, Sophie wrote, "November 15th, Dad threw beer can at floor." Threatened Mom 2 days later, things went further than Clara had ever endured. Richard came home to find a stack of company papers on the dining table, papers he himself had left there, but when Clara explained, he refused to listen. He shoved the documents to the floor, then suddenly knocked over the chair beside her. The chair struck the kitchen cabinet with a loud thud. Clara instinctively stepped back, one hand bracing the table for balance. From across the room, Sophie not only filmed but zoomed in, catching the moment her mother backed away from the towering man glaring down at her. When Richard disappeared into his office, Sophie ran over. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine." Clara tried to smile, her voice shaky. Sophie bit her lip. "Mom, I think it's enough." "Enough of what?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "Enough for Grandpa to believe we need help." Clara fell silent. Since Sophie had started her observations, she'd feared things would spiral out of control. But looking into her daughter's determined eyes, she realized maybe Sophie had been steering this from the beginning. That night, Clara lay awake. The sound of waves mixing with the wind's whistle through the window, background noise to a storm of thoughts. She remembered something her father, Walter, had said on the phone last year. "If you or Sophie are in trouble, call me. Don't hesitate. I've seen a lot of bad, but I'll never let anyone lay a hand on my family." The next morning, Sophie was up earlier than usual. When Clara came downstairs, she was already at the table, the safe folder on her tablet now filled with new videos. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Checking everything," Sophie replied without looking up, making sure. "It's all clear, no blurs, no static." Clara pulled out a chair and sat beside her. For several minutes, mother and daughter watched the clips together. Each one was a slice of truth Clara had tried to bury. The yelling, the crash of objects, her own shaky breaths, and the heavy, frightening silences that followed. Mom Sophie turned to her, voice small but firm. "If Grandpa sees these, he'll get us out of here." Clara didn't answer right away. She knew Sophie was right. And for the first time in years, the thought of leaving this house didn't paralyze her with fear. But another part of her still worried for her daughter's safety, for Richard's reaction if cornered. What she didn't know was that Sophie had already been preparing for that moment. That night, while Richard was upstairs, Sophie sent Walter a short email. "You need to see this. It's important. Mom and I need you." She attached the link to the entire safe folder. Across town, in his small harborside cabin, Walter Jennings received the message while sipping coffee. He opened each video, his expression darkening with every second. As a former police chief, he had seen plenty of evidence of domestic abuse, but when the victims were his daughter and granddaughter, the pressure in his chest was nearly unbearable. He closed the laptop, his eyes taking on the cold sharpness of his days on duty. Walter knew he needed to plan and this time. There would be no room for Richard to strike back. That morning, the sea at Cedar Cove looked unusually calm. Golden sunlight spread across the water, seagulls skimmed low and wheeled over the docks. But inside the seaside house, the air felt the opposite, thick, heavy, like the sky before a storm. Clara was wearing her apron, chopping onions in the kitchen, when she heard the front door slam. Richard had come home in the middle of the day, his face tight with irritation. "You forgot to pay the phone bill," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "Isn't this supposed to be paid on time?" Clara set down the knife, wiping her hands. "I thought you thought." Richard cut her off, stressing each word. "You always thought. You really are." Sophie sat at the dining table, head bent over her homework, but her hand subtly adjusted the angle of her tablet. As Richard moved closer to her mother, she tilted her head, pretending to erase a math problem, her gaze flicking toward the screen to make sure it was all being recorded. "Can you speak to me with some respect?" Clara asked, keeping her voice level. Richard gave a dry laugh, stepping back, but his parting line landed like a blow. "If I were being respectful, you wouldn't be in this house as my wife." He walked out, leaving the smell of cigarette smoke hanging in the air. Clara exhaled and went back to cooking, but Sophie closed her notebook, picked up the tablet, and slipped upstairs. In her small room with pale blue walls and shelves full of books, Sophie sat at her desk and opened the safe folder. Her fingers scrolled past rows of videos before stopping on the share button. She typed in an address she knew by heart: walter.jennings@cedarcove.net. This time, instead of sending silently, she tapped the video call icon. The screen filled. With a sun-weathered face, neatly combed silver hair, and bright blue eyes alert with caution, Walter Jennings. Behind him was a bookcase lined with police commendations and a few framed photos of him in uniform years ago. "Hi, Grandpa," Sophie said softly, her tone half greeting, half apology for calling in the middle of the day. Walter immediately sensed something off. "What's going on, kiddo?" Sophie glanced toward her door to be sure it was closed, then lowered her voice. "Grandpa, if someone hurt Mom, what would you do?" Walter leaned a little closer to the screen. "Who's someone?" "I'm just asking if," Sophie replied. But her eyes stayed locked on him. He was silent for a few seconds before answering slowly. "Anyone who harms your mom will answer for it. You know me, don't you?" "Yes." Sophie nodded, her lips pressed tight. "Going to send you something?" She hit send on a video file. Walter received it instantly, opened it, and didn't speak for the next 2 minutes. On screen, Richard stood close to Clara, shouting, pointing, and finally slamming his hand down on the table, making her flinch. When it ended, Walter looked up, his voice low. Was this the first time, or has it happened before? Sophie drew a deep breath. I have more. I'm working on a project for school, but it's really to protect Mom. After a beat, Walter said firmly, keep everything. Don't delete, don't edit. I want to see it all. Sophie nodded. Are you ready? I've been ready for a long time, Walter replied. And in his eyes, Sophie saw something both warm and dangerous, like a flame waiting to be fanned. That afternoon, Clara received a text from her father. When you feel safe enough to talk, call me. I won't push, but I need to know the truth. Clara's heart pounded as she read it. She guessed who had spoken to him, but felt no anger. In fact, part of her felt lighter this secret was no longer hers alone to carry. Late that night, when Richard was asleep, Clara went to Sophie's room. The girl was lying with a book in her hands, though her eyes weren't on the page. You talked to Grandpa, didn't you? Sophie slowly closed the book. I had to, Mom. You wouldn't say it yourself, so I did. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her daughter's hair back. He's going to worry a lot. Better worried than not knowing, Sophie replied quietly but firmly. He was the police chief. He'll know how to help us. Clara didn't argue. Fear was still there, but threaded through it was a fragile thread of hope. 4. The first time, she thought. If Walter stepped in, maybe things could change. 3 days later, Walter sent Sophie a short email. I've seen it all. Be patient. Keep everything safe. When the time comes, I'll be there. Sophie read it, tucked her tablet into her desk drawer, locked it, and slipped the key into her pocket. She knew the moment was coming. When it did, there would be no turning back. Late November in Cedar Cove usually sank into cold winds, but this year, a Harlow home was steeped in the scent of lilies and roasted meat, the smell of a grand event in the making. Richard was turning 40, and as always, he wanted a lavish celebration, inviting extended family, business partners, and a few influential figures from town. Clara knew exactly what such parties meant. They weren't about marking another year of life. They were Richard's stage for showing off, proving himself the successful man with the perfect family. Every detail from the tablecloths and wine glasses to the way she smiled had to be flawless. That afternoon, Richard brought home a meticulous list: menu, drinks, number of chairs, seating assignments for each guest. I want everything smooth tomorrow night, he said, placing the paper on the table like a command. No mistakes, no chaos, and absolutely no looking like you're at a funeral in front of the guests. Clara took the list, nodded, and said nothing. She had learned to swallow every reaction to keep the air still. Inside, though, it felt like barbed wire tightening around her ribs. At the kitchen table, Sophie pretended to work on homework, but was listening to every word. When Richard left the room, she leaned toward her mother and whispered, Don't worry, Mom, just get through tomorrow. Clara frowned. Get through. What are you? Everything's ready. Sophie cut in quickly, as if not wanting to answer further. That evening, Clara worked non-stop, marinating meat, chopping vegetables, polishing the crystal glasses Richard's mother had once given them, and had insisted be used only for special occasions. Richard drifted in and out of the kitchen, tossing out reminders. Don't burn that. Use the apple peeler, not the big knife. Rinse this glass again. There's still a spot. Sophie helped set the table, but Clara noticed her. Daughter's attention was more on the atmosphere than on the plates. Each time Richard spoke, Sophie's eyes flicked to her mother, measuring the room's temperature. Around 9 p.m., Richard went upstairs to take a phone call. His voice carried down the stairs, laced with bragging about the party everyone will remember. Clara washed dishes while Sophie quietly slipped her tablet from the drawer and checked the safe folder again. She played a few videos, adjusted the lighting, then sent an updated link to Walter. The message was only 4 words: tomorrow. Grandpa, across town. Walter received it while sitting in his small office. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he stared at the screen for a long moment, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a prepared file. Inside were printed stills from the videos, handwritten notes, and several legal documents an old colleague had helped him draft. Back at the Harlow house, the weight of tomorrow pressed hard on Clara's shoulders. After Sophie went to bed, she stayed in the living room folding napkins, her hands busy but her mind drifting. She kept picturing Richard at the party, his false smile, his hand placed on her shoulder like a tender gesture, but with fingers pressing just enough to remind her who held control. Soft footsteps startled her. Sophie stood on the stairs, clutching her teddy bear, her hair tousled from sleep. "You're not in bed yet?" the girl asked. "I still have a few things to finish." "Why are you up?" Sophie walked closer and sat beside her. "I think tomorrow might get loud. Don't be scared if Grandpa shows up." Clara froze. "Sophie, you mom." Sophie interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to wait anymore. I've waited long enough." Clara looked at her daughter and saw a piece of herself in those ease apart that had once been strong, once knew how to resist, but had been buried under years of fear. "You just have to trust me," Sophie went on. "It's going to be okay." Clara didn't answer. She simply pulled Sophie into her arms. She knew they were standing on the edge of something big, though she couldn't picture exactly how it would break. When Sophie returned to her room, Clara sat alone a little longer. She took her phone, opened her contacts, and scrolled to Dad Walter's number. Her finger hovered over the call button, but then she locked the screen. She wasn't ready to speak, but part of her felt he already knew everything. By midnight, the house was silent. Clara slipped into bed beside Richard, who was already asleep. But she couldn't close her eyes, because beneath the sound of the waves outside, she could almost hear another rhythm, the quiet, steady pulse of a plan Sophie had been building for weeks. And tomorrow, everything would come to light. The next morning, Cedar Cove woke under a thin veil of sea mist. In the seaside house, Clara had been up since dawn, finishing the last details. The kitchen carried the warm scent of roast chicken and fresh-baked bread. On the dining table, a spotless white cloth was laid. Crystal glasses gleamed in the muted light spilling through the windows. Richard appeared at the stairs in a gray suit with a red tie, hair slicked back, cologne rich with a woody note. "Good," he said, scanning the kitchen. "Keep everything exactly like this tonight." And his gaze fixed on Clara. "Don't embarrass me." Clara nodded lightly. Sophie, sitting at the corner of the dining table, pretended to work on a jigsaw puzzle, her tablet lying beside her. Screen black, but camera set to standby. By evening, guests began to arrive. The sounds of greetings, laughter, and clinking glasses mixed with soft background music. Richard seemed like a different man, charming, generous, quick, with a joke. He moved through the room, shaking hands, introducing Clara as his wonderful wife and Sophie as his well-mannered daughter. But Clara knew that beneath the polished exterior was a cold, sharp edge ready to cut the moment she slipped. The party unfolded in the spacious living room, with a long table set near the windows overlooking the sea. Clara stood at one end, pouring wine for guests. Sophie sat mid-table beside a distant cousin she barely spoke to, eyes quietly scanning the room like a watchful sentry. Richard's performance began when an old friend rose to toast Richard. "You're the perfect example of a man who's made it solid career, happy family." Richard grinned, draping an arm over Clara's shoulder. "Lucky for me. With a wife who runs everything at home, I can focus on business." It sounded like praise, but the pressure of his hand on her shoulder made Clara wince. Dinner carried on with stories of his successes, slipping gradually into harmless jokes loaded with meaning. A cousin chuckled. "Clara, how do you put up with Richard's temper?" Richard smirked. "She can handle it. My wife knows her place." Laughter rippled around the table. Clara forced a smile, but heat flushed through her. Sophie lowered her head, fingers laced in her lap. The tablet's camera still trained on her parents. By dessert, a female guest, one of Richard's business partners, remarked casually, "In this town, where else can you find a woman like Clara, willing to stay home, take care of husband and child, and give up her own opportunities?" Richard took a sip of wine, answering with a joke, sharp as a blade. "Yeah. She's let go of those silly dreams, going back to school. Working outside, not really her thing." The table erupted in laughter. Someone added, "The fewer dreams a woman has, the happier she be." Something cracked inside Clara's chest. She had learned to stay silent, but tonight, with Sophie's eyes on her and dozens of witnesses, she couldn't swallow it. "And you think saying that in front of our daughter is a good idea?" Clara's voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly across the room. The laughter cut off. Richard turned, smile stiffening. "Clara, you want me to play the wife who knows her place so you can look good? Sorry, but tonight I'm not playing that role." A murmur passed around the table. Richard gripped his wineglass, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You're making a fool of yourself." "No." Clara met his eyes. "I'm telling the truth." And then Richard shoved his chair back. The screech of wood on floor cracked the air. In a heartbeat, Clara saw his hand rise. Then the slap landed, the sound tearing through the room like the shattering of glass. She staggered back, her cheek blazing. No one moved. Only the surf outside and Richard's heavy breathing filled the silence. "Don't you ever embarrass me in front of people again," he growled. Sophie was already on her feet, clutching her tablet to her chest. Her voice cut through the stunned quiet, steady, chillingly calm. "You just lost more than your pride, Dad." Every head turned toward her. She stepped forward, voice unwavering. "Everything you just didn't. A lot more. I've recorded it all." Richard froze. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "And I've sent it to Grandpa. He's on his way." The air locked tight. Whispers stirred around the table, but in Clara's chest, for the first time in years, fear was pushed aside by something else. Hope. For a few seconds after Sophie's words, "Grandpa's on his way," the room froze. Outside, the surf kept its steady rhythm, but inside, every pair of eyes fixed on the 10-year-old standing in the center of the living room. Clutching her tablet like a shield, Richard blinked, as if not quite processing. Then he laughed, a short, dry laugh with no trace of humor. "Kid, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Sophie didn't retreat. She drew a breath, her voice calm but carrying clearly. "This isn't a game. It's the truth." Richard strode toward her, but Sophie tilted the tablet, tapped the screen. A video burst to life, its sound filling the room. Richard shouting. Something slamming to the floor, Clara's voice breaking in pain. Around the table, eyes widened. A few faces flushed with shock. One aunt set her spoon down with a sharp clink against porcelain. Richard reached to snatch the tablet, but Sophie was faster. Stepping back toward the corner of the table, gaze locked on him. "It's all backed up," she said, voice even, but with steel underneath. "On the cloud, in Grandpa's email, and somewhere else, too." An uncle closest to them spoke up, his voice low. "Richard, is this real?" "No," Richard snapped, turning on the cluster of relatives. "She's making it up. She doesn't understand adult matters." Sophie tilted her head, uncanny echo of her grandfather in interrogation photos she'd seen. I understand perfectly. I know what you did to Mom, how many times, and on which days. I have it all. She glanced at Clara, her eyes carrying a silent apology for laying everything bare. But Clara only stood still, one hand cupping her stinging cheek, her heart pounding. With shock, and despite everything a flicker of pride, Richard let out another brittle laugh, though it quivered at the edges. You think those little videos will do anything? Protect Mom, Sophie answered instantly, and show everyone who you really are. The air seemed to thicken. Some guests began rising from their seats, avoiding Richard's gaze. Someone murmured about needing fresh air. Richard turned to his mother. Margaret, as if for backup. Mom, say something. Margaret pressed her lips together, eyes shifting between her son and granddaughter. Finally, she said only, if she has proof, we should take it seriously. Sophie swiped to another file. The screen showed Richard knocking over a chair, Clara stumbling back against the kitchen cabinet, and his threat ringing crystal clear. No one in the room could mistake it for a normal marital spat. I kept everything so that one day Sophie lifted her gaze, her voice thick but steady. Mom and I wouldn't have to be afraid in our own home. Clara felt something lodge in her throat. These were words she had only dared to think. In sleepless nights, Richard stood rigid, scanning the room for allies, finding only averted eyes or looks of judgment. He swallowed hard, then took a step toward Sophie. Give me the tablet. No, the word came fast, like a blade. Grandpa told me never to hand evidence to the person in it. Richard's mouth twisted, but the growl of an engine outside cut him off. Brakes squealed. A car door slammed. Sophie glanced toward the window, her lips pressing into a thin line. He's here, she said, and for the first time during the entire standoff, a small, almost triumphant curve lifted one corner of her mouth in that instant. Clara knew everything had shifted into a direction Richard could no longer control. The car engine outside went silent, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the stone walkway. The living room door swung open, not the slow turn of a polite guest, but the firm, decisive push of a man who had stepped through hundreds of doorways. In his career catching criminals, Walter Jennings stood in the doorway. His black overcoat was buttoned to the collar, his steel blue eyes sweeping the room in seconds, taking in every detail. Clara, by the corner of the table, one cheek flushed red. Sophie clutching her tablet tight to her chest. Richard in a tailored suit but wearing a mask of strained composure, and guests shrinking back as if caught in something they wanted no part of. Evening? Walter's voice was low, each word carrying. I think I'm right on time. Richard forced a veneer of calm, stepping halfway forward with an outstretched hand. Walter, I didn't know you would put your hand down. Walter cut in, his gaze locked on Richard. We're not starting with handshakes. Tonight, the air in the room tightened. Walter moved straight to Sophie, resting a hand on her shoulder. You okay? I'm okay, Grandpa, Sophie said softly but steadily. Everything's safe. Walter nodded, then turned to Clara. His eyes lingered on the mark on her cheek, his jaw tightening. How long, Clara? She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, too long. Walter inhaled deeply, reining in his temper, then drew a thick folder from his coat pocket. He set it on the table in front of Richard. Printouts from the videos, audio transcripts, Sophie's notes, his voice even but heavy as a gavel. I've seen everything, and I brought something else. Another man stepped in, a broad-shouldered figure in a blue shirt, introducing himself as Officer Owens, one of Walter's old colleagues, still active with the Cedar Cove Police Department. He pulled a set of papers from his case. Emergency Protection Order. Richard Harlow is to vacate the premises immediately and have no contact with Clara Jennings, Harlow, or Sophie Harlow. Richard gave a scoffing laugh. This is my house. It's marital property, Owens replied without blinking. But under state law, with evidence of domestic abuse, the court can grant temporary exclusive use to the victim. And we have more than enough evidence. Walter leaned in just slightly, his voice like sharpened steel. Did you really think I'd leave my daughter and granddaughter here with you for one more night? Richard swallowed, his eyes darting to the silent guests. No one met his gaze, even his mother. Margaret kept her head down. Sophie's voice rang out, clear as glass. I've recorded everything. From yelling at Mom over dinner to throwing things, knocking over chairs. If anyone wants to see it, I can play it right now. No one spoke. Only the sound of wind seeping through the eaves broke the silence. Walter turned back to Clara. You and Sophie upstairs. Pack what you need. We leave now. Clara hesitated. Years in this house, however suffocating, had filled it with memories and things she'd worked for. But when she saw Sophie's eyes hopeful, urging, she nodded. While mother and daughter gathered their things, Richard retreated to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself a drink. Walter, you're blowing this out of proportion. This is family business. Clara and I will work it out. You had your chance to work it out. Walter's voice stayed flat. You chose violence. Richard started to retort, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs cut him off. Clara descended with her coat on, carrying a small suitcase. Sophie still held her tablet, as if it were the most important thing she owned. Walter stepped forward, taking the suitcase from Clara and guiding both women toward the door. Let's go, Clara. We can still. Richard called after her. She turned back, meeting his eyes without lowering hers. No, we have nothing left. The door shut behind them, ending whatever words Richard had ready. Outside, the sea wind was biting. But Clara found each breath easier than the air she'd been breathing inside. Walter opened the car door for Sophie, then looked at his daughter. From now on, you and Sophie stay with me. This is the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Clara nodded, hugging him tight. For the first time in years, she let herself believe they might truly be safe. 3 years had passed since that winter night in Cedar Cove, when Clara and Sophie left the seaside house under Walter's protection. So much had changed, all of it for the better. Clara now lived in a bright apartment in the town center, less than a 10-minute walk from Sophie's school and the hospital. From the balcony, she could still see the ocean in the distance, but from a safe remove. Far enough to remember, but no longer trapped in the past. After completing her certification in child trauma counseling, Clara worked at a support center for victims of domestic violence. She was often the first person young girls or women spoke to when they needed to tell their story. And every time she sat across from a fearful face, Clara thought of Sophie, the little girl who once quietly gathered every scrap of evidence to save them both. Sophie, now 13, was taller, her hair longer, and her eyes just as steady as they'd been 3 years before. She excelled at school, especially in science, and still played piano every Saturday night, a habit no one forbade anymore. In the corner of the living room stood the old upright piano Walter had bought from an abandoned church, a symbol of what they'd reclaimed. Richard had been released from prison the previous spring. By court order, he could only communicate through his lawyer and could request to see Sophie only if she agreed. She never had. The letters from his lawyer, sometimes pleading, sometimes claiming he had changed, were kept in a locked wooden box. I'll read them if I ever want to, Sophie told her mother. But not now. Walter remained the family's anchor, though he'd fully retired from consulting with the police. He spent more time tending the garden behind his house and rowing with the Harbor Club. But whenever Clara had a late shift or something urgent, he was the one picking Sophie up, taking her to music lessons, or simply sharing dinner and old stories. One early summer afternoon, sunlight spilled across the living room as Sophie opened her laptop to show her mother a school presentation. The title read, Evidence and Justice: Why the Truth Matters. In the opening, Sophie anonymously told the story of a girl who collected proof to protect her family from abuse. Who do you think that girl might be? Clara teased. Sophie smiled. Just someone who believes silence isn't always golden. That evening, Walter stopped by with a new picture frame. Inside was a photo of the three of them on the beach last year, sunlit. Windswept, no shadow in anyone's eyes. "Let's hang it here," he said, pointing to the wall opposite the piano. Clara helped him mount it. Stepping back, she realized that the wall, once the barest spot in the home, had become a focal point, just like their lives, once hollowed out by fear, now filled with proof of trust and peace. A few weeks later, at the center, Clara met an 11-year-old boy who came in with his mother. He looked at her warily, but when she smiled and said, "You know, I once met a girl even younger than you who stood up to protect her mom," he sat down and began to talk. Clara didn't say it was Sophie's story, but silently she sent her daughter a thank you. That autumn, Sophie received the school's Outstanding Citizen award for teaching her peers about personal safety rights and the importance of evidence. On stage, she glanced toward the front row where Clara and Walter sat. Walter's small nod said it all. "You're doing the right thing." That night, the three of them sat on the porch, sipping hot cocoa. The sea was still Cedar Cove's sea, but no longer a wall that confined them. It was the backdrop to a new picture, one where three people had chosen to protect each other and succeeded. Clara knew the past would never vanish. There would still be nights she dreamed of shouting voices or the grip of Richard's hand on her arm. But when she woke, she would hear Sophie's piano in the living room and Walter's voice from the kitchen. "Tea's good this morning." And she'd remember they'd gotten out. One late December day, Sophie unlocked the wooden box of unread letters from Richard. She picked up one envelope, looked at it for a long moment, then set it back. "I'm still not ready," she said. "But at least now I know I have the choice." Clara smiled, pulling her into a hug. "That's right. The choice made your freedom." Outside, the winter wind began to sweep through Cedar Cove. Inside the small home, the fireplace burned warm, and Sophie's piano played unbroken, unshaken, and never interrupted by any other voice again. Asterisk, perhaps. The most beautiful part of today's story is not just the signing of the protection order or the return of peaceful days, but the moment of Father Walter put aside all anger and regret to open his arms and bring his daughter Clara and granddaughter Sophie back to where they truly belong. Clara came to understand that a parent's love never disappears. It only waits for the right moment to become the strongest shield. And Sophie will grow up carrying the memory that, in the most dangerous moment of her life, her family did not abandon her. Thank you for listening until the very end of today's Snail story. And if today's story has touched you, leave a comment. Who knows, your words might just become the starting point for a new journey here at Snail Story. That night, Cedar Cove was utterly still. Only the hush of the waves offshore and the warm yellow glow from Walter's small cabin filled the darkness. The air carried the scent of dried pine and roasted coffee, and something Clara couldn't remember feeling for years. Safety Walter had prepared everything in advance. On the kitchen table lay 2 sets of keys, one for Clara, one for Sophie, with a simple instruction: "This is your home now. No one crosses that threshold unless you say so." Sophie sat at the table beside a mug of warm milk, her tablet open. She was playing through the video files again, this time, not to hide them, but to show Walter. After each clip, Walter gave a small nod, his blue eyes growing colder. Clara could tell he was threading every piece together, just as he'd done in his years working cases. "Tomorrow," Walter said, his tone solid as stone, "I'll meet with the lawyer and the police department. We'll make sure the protective order is extended, and he will be prosecuted." Clara glanced at Sophie, who kept her gaze on the screen, lips pressed together. She laid a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You don't have to watch these again. I want to make sure nothing's lost," Sophie said quietly. "This is the proof. That means we never have to go back there." Clara stayed silent, torn between ache and pride. The next morning, Walter drove Clara to the local courthouse to sign for an emergency divorce filing. The lawyer he'd retained, a petite but sharp-eyed woman, had already prepared nearly all the paperwork from Sophie's files. Clara only had to read and sign while they waited. Sophie sat in the courthouse lobby, hugging the teddy bear Walter had found for her in the attic. A passing police officer recognized Walter, gave him a nod, then bent toward Sophie. "You're the brave girl everyone's been talking about, aren't you?" Sophie only gave a small smile, but Clara noticed the flush on her cheeks. By the third day after leaving, Richard had been officially served. The police told Walter they had ample grounds to charge him with domestic assault and threats. Walter's reply was short: "Good." News traveled fast in Cedar Cove, a town where nothing stayed secret for long. Whispers followed Clara's name in the coffee shop, the supermarket, the harbor. Some old neighbors texted to apologize for not realizing sooner. Others admitted, "We suspected, but didn't think we should interfere." Clara answered them all with one sentence: "It's over now." But for Sophie, it wasn't just an ending. It was the start of the normal life she once thought was out of reach. That evening, in Walter's living room, Sophie spread her school books across the table. Clara, making tea, asked, "What's the first thing you want to do?" "Learn piano again," Sophie answered instantly. "Remember, I started a few songs before, but Dad said it was too loud." Clara smiled, feeling as if a small door had just opened. "I remember. I'll find you a class." From his office doorway, Walter overheard and said, "There's a Saturday class at the community center. I'll take you this week." Sophie nodded, her eyes lighting up. The next day, Clara accompanied Walter to a real estate office. He advised her to sell her share of the marital home and use the money to buy something smaller, closer to Sophie's school and the hospital where. Clara planned either to return to teaching or try working with abused children. "You don't have to rush," Walter told her as he signed documents. "But don't chain yourself to a place that only holds bad memories." A week later, the court issued a temporary ruling. Clara had full custody of Sophie. Richard could only contact her through lawyers, and any visitation, if allowed, would be supervised. When the papers arrived, Clara felt part of the weight lift from her shoulders. Sophie skimmed the document, then hugged her mother. "We're free now." That night, the three of them, Walter, Clara, and Sophie, sat on the cabin porch watching the night sea. The wind carried salt, and the waves beat like a steady heartbeat. Clara turned to her father. "Thank you. If it weren't for you," Walter shook his head. "If it weren't for Sophie, I might still be at home, knowing nothing. She's the one who opened this door." Sophie smiled faintly, but Clara saw in her eyes something older than her years, a trace only found in children who have lived too long in fear. Clara knew the legal battle wasn't over, but now they had truly broken free of the chains. And, for the first time in years, she believed tomorrow would be different.